In 1983, I was running an advertising company, a film company. I was living life in the fast lane, making television shows and traveling all over the world with crews. And one morning, something snapped. I woke up in my house, and my house was all black. You can't imagine a house like that. The floors were black, the walls were black, the furniture was black, the dishes were black. The pictures were framed in black frames. It was the strangest place to step into. I woke up in the morning and something inside of me said it was time to go. And I left. I didn't just walk away, but walked away from a business and union employees. I walked away from my own child who would have to grow up without me. I disappeared, vanished into thin air. I had no idea what was happening to me, none whatsoever. I ended up briefly in New York City, where I took a people's airplane flight, crossed the ocean for $99, and flew to Brussels, the most boring place in the world. That said, after landing, I immediately went to Amsterdam, less boring. In Amsterdam, I would meet the forces in the costume of a kid. I don't know how old he was, 17 years old, maybe 18 years old, a college kid from the States. And he asked me where I was going. And I said I didn't know. He said, "Go to Ibiza." I said, "What's Ibiza?" He said, "It's an island in the Mediterranean. I'll tell you how to get there." Not only did he tell me how to get there, he put me on a magic bus. I took the last magic bus to Barcelona from Amsterdam. This kid, I had sent him out to see if he could score me some grass. We were staying in one of those hotels in the red light district in Amsterdam. I fell asleep. And when I got up in the morning, I went down to the Magic Bus depot and got on the Magic Bus and headed for Spain. When I arrived at the Spanish border and the Guardia Civil, the police, came on the bus, they looked around and then pointed to me. I figured I was in trouble. a- I had disappeared. I had a business and people who were looking for me. They had my picture in the newspaper. They took me off the bus and into a room and they opened up my bag. And sitting on the top of my bag was a joint. These guys get really upset. "What's this? Do you know what this is?" And I'm going, "Yes, it's not mine." And they're asking if I know. And they lit it and waved it in the air. They took me in to see the chief in his office. Behind his office, behind his desk, was a window, and behind the window was the bus. The lights were on in the office, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and everybody in the bus was looking in. And this guy told me to take off all my clothes. So everybody on the bus witnessed me arriving in Spain like a newborn child. I took off all my clothes, and the chief said to me, "It wasn't yours, right?" And I said, "No, it wasn't mine." He said, "You can go." When I left, the cops were very nicely repacking my bag, and one of them said to me, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Ibiza." He smiled and said, "You're going to have a good time." We arrived in Barcelona. The bus was late because of me. I raced down to the port and I got them to give me a ticket because the ship was just leaving. After just managing to get on the ship, I counted the money only to discover that the ticket agent, under the pressure, made a mistake. I ended up with more money than what I had given him. They gave me the trip for free. So I sailed. Not only did the kid tell me to go to Ibiza, he told me of a place in Santa Eulalia, a place called Sandy's Bar. It was known all over the world. I went directly there on arrival. In the bar, there was only one customer, and he immediately began a conversation with me. At some point, he asked, "What's your name?" And I said, "Ra." Now, that was not my name. My name was Robert. Suddenly, there was no Bert, and I was Ra. I arrived naked. They had sailed me across the sea. They brought me to the island and gave me a name. Most human beings are embarrassed with madness. I had no problems with going mad. As a matter of fact, I actually liked going mad. It was the most interesting thing that had ever happened to me. In the course of the next 3 years, I would go through a period of what I call deconstruction. That is, I arrived. I had very little money with me, and I got a job working at a local country school. The woman who ran the school, a Canadian, half Indian, gave me a little place to stay up in the hills. When I say place, I mean place. There was no house. I borrowed a chair from the school and I climbed up into a tree and I put the chair in the tree and I lived there for a year. It was quite an experience. I came from culture and wealth. I grew up in the privilege of material comfort. And there I was, an incredible freak living in a tree. At night, to put myself to sleep, I would sing. There's been one consistency that has run through my whole life from before my experience and after my experience, and that's teaching. I've always loved to teach. I started teaching when I was very young, working with even younger children. In my career as a teacher over the years, I have literally taught at every level. I arrived on the island with nothing, and I was very fortunate that I was able to find work. I got a job as a country school teacher, the Morna Valley School. Actually, it was a Mary's school then, an extraordinary woman, Canadian actually, like me. She had arrived here on the island, and there were absolutely no schools for children that didn't speak Spanish. She had a number of kids as she began to self school them, and that attracted other foreigners who had children who were not doing well or were uncomfortable in the local school. And slowly but surely, Mary's school became the Morna Valley School. When I arrived on the island in 1983, it had about 75 students. It was my great serendipity and good fortune to meet her. Not only did she give me a job, I would be a history, English, and French teacher for kids from 10 years old to 17 years old. But she gave me an extraordinary place to live. It wasn't a house or anything, it was just land high on the mountain above the Morna Valley. It was there that I lived in a tree for my first year on the island. It was a time to decondition, to step out of all of the Western trappings that have been so much a part of my life, and to really live in another world as a new being. It was a remarkable year living in the tree and getting up in the morning and going down into the valley and down into this country school and working with kids. I'd entered into an experience that was far more than anything I could have ever possibly imagined. It certainly was not what I expected. I enjoyed it immensely. It was a wonderful experience, but it began to drag on me. I spent 2 years, 2 seasons actually, teaching there. I got tired of it. Got tired of it's one of the dilemmas of curriculum for children. You can teach a year's worth of curriculum in about a month if you want to. So much of teaching is filler. And I had just had enough. And obviously, it was a part of my trajectory. I was heading towards something very different in my life. So I left the school. I had befriended a number of young kids who had a lot of problems in the school, discipline problems, behavioral problems, interest problems. They were basically bored, understimulated kids. And I decided to have my own school, the school of everything. I had 4 kids and had them for 3 months. And in those 3 months, I taught them the history of the universe. We started with the Big Bang. I went through this process to try to simplify so it could be taught. The whole complex evolutionary process of the development of the universe and ultimately the planet itself and life on the planet. It was an incredible experience. I taught these children ancient memory systems so that they could store enormous amounts of information. It was simply a remarkable experience. But it was more than that for me and for my story. I had moved into a house. It's called Kas Kostu. It was on a piece of property not far from the village of San Juan Bautista. It had once been a farm. About 350 years ago, settlers had built a house there. Unfortunately for them, they ran out of water about 75 years later, and the house was abandoned. Nobody lived in that house for hundreds of years. It was slowly deteriorating into a ruina. In the 1970s, a musician bought the property and had the corral where the sheep were kept redesigned and turned into a very pretty small house. Up above it was the old ruina of the main house. And of course, it was in that ruina that I would have my experience, my encounter with the voice. All the real magic that I was about to encounter, magic that I had never known, began with entering into that house. Began, in fact, with the school of everything. I suppose, in many ways, that no story about my process is complete without drugs. And I know that's often not politically correct to discuss. I was certainly very much a part of the 60s generation. As a musician, I was introduced very early in my process to drugs. I'll also say there were hardly there was hardly anything that in the years that I was involved in that chemistry, and there was hardly anything that I didn't experience or experience in depth to be direct. I was a loner, an integration being. I had these enormous journeys into altered states. And while I was teaching in the second month of my little house that was in back of the house, something came into my life that was really the trigger, in a sense, to a long process that would ultimately lead me to my encounter. I guess it began with the late John Lilly. From John Lilly, it came to me through a friend of mine. He came up to me one day and said to me, "There is this incredible thing that you should really try." I thought, well, all right. On the 17th of October in 1985, in my little classroom, after the students had gone home, as the sun was setting, I had an out of body experience where I flew into an aroma field that I could only describe as the smell of consciousness. What was so extraordinary about that experience was that on the inside, I was lost in this aroma field. But on the outside, not that I could hear it, I am told that I kept on saying over and over, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." Within weeks of that experience, something began to happen to me. I don't really know how to describe it. It was initiated with a fast. I suddenly had no appetite, had no desire whatsoever to eat. It would last 16 days. And during that time, not only was I synthesizing and simplifying the chemistry and biology and physics of the totality for children, I was also being introduced for the very first time in my life to the esoteric, to esoteric books and esoteric concepts. This binary, the simplifying of the exoteric and the entering into the esoteric, was inspiring. I began to have flashes of acute awareness, recognition of things. A whole transformation began to take place in the way in which I looked at the world and thought about the world. The Life and Death of Robin Joseph, excerpts from the prequels to Encounter, page 5. There's two poems, and I'll just read them. First, I fell on that night like a stone into the embrace of the forces, but it was the start, not the beginning. There was the jumping off point, the return to the light before the descent into darkness. Next, Einstein's picture, quarks, neutrinos, pulsars, novas, pine trees, the slatted doors with the dying light for decoration. Old Jesse, so damn serious in his best role, bless his soul, playing DJ to whining motorcycles and the little brown bottle the golden cap, and the needle, through whose eye there is no camel like G. Forgive me not, all that rot. It sank in soft, porous, nothing really there anyway. The illusion play, cold within, pushing the syringe down and down in a dream, out and over, and suddenly alone in the space compressing, faster and faster, and the voice, is it Thursday? And my reply, I think so. And again, is this a drug? And my reply, I don't know, but this is it. And off towards the speed of light, the fright and the G force compressing my face, my chest against some flying brace into space, into the smell, the scent of God. October 17th, 1985. Ibiza, Cascashu, and no regrets. I thank my lucky stars every day. The shaman way. I had no idea what was happening to me. When you are raised in the affluence of Western culture, with all of its neatly programmed media presentations of life, it is really alien, the shaman way. What the shaman way is all about is shattering that has to take place, the surprise. I think the most astonishing thing for me in my own process was the depth of surprise. I remember a scorpion night in 1985 when I was in the countryside in a beautiful renovated finca, one of these magical little houses, pearls of white shining in the moonlight. I was together with two companions. It wasn't a very eventful evening, and at some point they went off to sleep, and I was sitting alone. I'd been through a very strange thing. I was running an experimental school, and in the process of being involved in that, suddenly I had stopped eating. The fast would last for 16 days. I think it was the fourth or fifth day when a friend of mine had come to me quite concerned about my physical system because, according to him, I had not prepared properly and that I needed to clean out my intestinal system and all these things. He had given me an herbal concoction that he claimed was going to work immediately. Well, it didn't work immediately. 16 days later, I was at this house alone, my companions asleep, and I was sitting with my back to a lit fire in the fireplace. In front of me was a catch all table with all kinds of things on it. There was a brand new, untouched jotting pad. While I was sitting there, the door opened, just opened. Though it was startling, I just assumed, well, okay, the door opened. Something must have opened it. So I went over and I closed the door. I went back and sat by the fire. The door opened again, and the cat of the house walked in. I had a very strange feeling. At the same time, I had what I can only describe as the most incredible abdominal cramps. The concoction, 16 days later, seemed to have done its work. Rather than using the bathroom in the house, I went outside. It was an incredible night. There was no moon yet. The sky was full of stars. And not too far from the house was a huge algroba tree, a carob tree. And I squatted down under that tree. I don't mean to be vulgar, but the blackness of the ooze that left my body was an incredible statement to being cleaned out. And while I was in this odd situation, I heard something. It seemed to be the sound of an airplane. I could clearly hear it. At first, in essence, I paid no attention to it because it sounded like an airplane. But there was a problem with that. There was no Doppler effect. It wasn't either coming closer or going further away. There was just this strange sound. And it seemed like for me, it was everywhere. As a matter of fact, it was hard to tell whether the sound was inside my head or outside my head. I have no way of knowing. Anyway, I went back into the room. And when I went back into the room again, I sat down by the fire to warm. It was a cool November night. I had closed the door behind me for the third time, the door opened up. And I had the same experience, the same pressure physically, the odd feeling in the back of my neck with this eeriness of the door opening. And out I went again to finish my process. And the moment I stepped outside, the sound was there, everywhere. I finally went back in and sat down, and I stared at this very pretty jotting pad. Beside it was a gold plated pen, and I watched. Because I didn't do. I watched my hand reach in and grab this thing and the pen. What I remember is opening it up and clicking the back of the pen and then nothing else. As far as it seemed to me from hindsight, I obviously lost consciousness. I was no longer present. At some point, I was kind of startled into awakeness, and in front of me, in my hand, was this mystery that was probably the most frightening thing I had ever experienced. It was an incredible surprise. It was full of glyphs and writing. Funny enough, the very first page was a very stylized G, just the letter G. And inside were formulas and notations. There were things I simply did not recognize. I had no idea where they had come from, no recollection whatsoever. I can remember in the flush of that surprise trying to wake one of my companions up and blurting out, "You've got to see this. You can't imagine what has just happened to me." They weren't interested. I remember telling them, "Well, you'll never get to see it." I had a sense of light coming. I grabbed a cloak that was hanging by the door and shrouded myself in it. It was many sizes too big for me. A huge black cloak that I had around my body, carrying this notepad in my hand. And I walked outside. As I stepped down the stairs from the house, I was literally turned around. I mean, literally turned around, as if two hands had reached out from someplace and grabbed me by my midriff and just simply twisted me around. And the moon had risen, huge over the house. And I was startled about how big it seemed. And there was this sound, this incredible sound of an airplane. Again, I was grabbed and twisted and turned to the horizon. And in that moment of turning to the horizon, the whole valley where I was filled with cries. There were horses that were neighing, there were dogs that were howling, and there were roosters that were crowing. I could see the sun coming up. I could see Mercury rising. And then I couldn't see anything. Nothing. Just pulsing frequencies of, I don't know how to describe it, like a fully pixelated screen that constantly keeps vibrating. I don't know how long it lasted. I don't know how long I stood in that state. I could feel the pressure physically on my head, and then it ended. It was over. I would not know for weeks actually what I had truly experienced. In that moment of that sunrise, that was the closest proximity of Halley's Comet, the great messenger, Halley's Comet, Mercury and the sun, and the frequency of that moment. This was long before The Voice. It was my first taste of real magic, an incredible thing, the shaman way, and nothing more incredible than the cosmic surprise. One of the things about that event was that somehow I came out of that event believing that at the one of the things about that event was that somehow I came out of that event believing that at the autumnal equinox, I was going to die. That would have been about 10 months away. It was crystal clear to me that I was going to die. I remember waking up, one of the men in the room, and saying, "You've got to see this. This is incredible." He told me to leave him alone, that he wanted to go back to sleep. They never got to see it. As a matter of fact, nobody ever got to see it. I would eventually burn it. After my experience with the voice and the fate of having to return to this place, I tried to get rid of everything, and it would eventually go up in flames. But anyway, my death. As I said, madness has its comedic moments. Just about anyone that I would encounter, and I didn't encounter a lot of people, I was of interest. I was in a tribal environment, and the people knew of me, about me, sort of. Sooner or later, it became known that I was going to die at the autumnal equinox. This was in 1986. The autumnal equinox, as it turns out, was almost exactly my Uranus opposition. What would end up being an enormous changing point in my life because 3 months later, I would meet the voice. It became island gossip. There's this crazy guy who is going to kill himself on the autumnal equinox and the stories like that. And it was interesting to see the reactions. There were those who simply didn't know what was going on, and those who had all kinds of opinions and assumptions. I lived mostly separate from everything. Only occasionally would I go in the village and find out what people were thinking. Anyway, the day of the event was an interesting thing. Early in the morning, somebody who I had known for many years picked me up on the roadway as I was walking up the village and invited me around to their place. I was with my dog, Barley Barley. Barley was a dangerous creature and a serial killer of wildlife. We went over to his house together and Barley sat outside the front door and I went inside and sat down. He said to me, "I have to ask you something. Are you going to kill yourself today?" I said, "No, I'm not going to kill myself today." "So, what are all these stories about?" I said, "I don't know. I'm just as curious as you are. I have no I have no intent of doing myself any harm." The conversation petered out after that sort of straightforward communication, and there was silence. In that silence, there was this frequency. If I was going to be dramatic, I'd say that you could smell the angel of death. And by, it was that intense. Both of us realized at exactly the same moment what was going on. Arlie had gone into my friend's chicken house and he had killed everything in there, just tore it apart. It was a horrendous scene. The dog was covered in blood, and I went off with my dog Barley, leaving this poor man in a state of shock. It frightened me. It frightened me in the sense that it was very spooky and it seemed like an omen. And I went back. It was supposed to take place at sunset. During the afternoon, I had a visit. Somebody that I knew. They had a gift. The gift that they had was playing a card game called Passion, a very strange game. A game in which you give various cards in the deck a name, that is, a personality based on a person that you know. And in the way you lay out the cards, you can actually supposedly read events and read the future. This person was telling me that all this was nonsense and why was I going through with all of this and that it was a dangerous game, whatever it was. I said, "Well, read the cards and tell me." So he laid out the cards. I didn't simply know that I was going to die on that day. I knew how it was going to happen. I knew that a man was going to stab me with a knife. That's what I knew. And that was what I was carrying within me. I had not told anybody that. Just simply what got out was that on this day, I was supposedly going to die. This person laid out the cards and went as pale can be because they told me that there was somebody that was going to attack me and it made them very uncomfortable. They picked it all up and just walked out. So I sat in the heat. It was hot, as Ibiza could be at the equinox, and I waited. About an hour before the sunset, I went to a roadside cafe, Can Kerna. It's a strange old place that faces the highway. They had an outside terrace and tables. I went over to one of these tables and sat there by myself. Over the next 45 minutes, a whole bunch of people showed up, I guess, waiting to see what would happen. So we all sat there. It was very strange. It's a very strange scene. At some point, the sun began to set, and a car pulled up with somebody who I knew. The moment that I saw them, I knew that this was the person. They went into the cafe, and I sat there. At some point, my bladder I needed to go to the bathroom. So I got up from the table and I walked around to where the cars were parked to go to the back of this place and use their facilities. As I passed this person's car, it was an old Renault 4 with this kind of dashboard that is open like a shelf. On that shelf in his car was a dagger, a big one, just sitting there. I went around and went into the bathroom and I came back out. The light began to fade and I began to get agitated. If this was supposed to happen, then let's get on with it, was sort of my attitude. I'm getting tired of sitting here and the pressure of all these people. So I got up and went over to the cafe, ostensibly to go inside and pay. Go inside and pay my bill for the coffee or the tea that I had had. When I went into this guy, I went when I went in, this guy was dead drunk, his head down on the table. He was entirely immobile. So I paid and walked out and turned to everyone and said good night and went up to where I was staying in the hills, my little tent. I went into the tent, got into bed, and I went to sleep. I don't know. Maybe an hour later, there was a sound. I heard my tent opening up. It was a young Spanish guy that I knew. He said to me, Ra, do you really want to die? Because I will kill you. I said, no, I'm tired. I just want to go to sleep. And he left. I went into total isolation, not voluntary, by the way. No one would have done anything. Oh, so I went into total isolation, not voluntary, by the way. No one would have anything to do with me. They decided I was as mad as a hatter. I died. Truly, I died. I didn't even know it. It would take 3 months. It would take until the voice arrived to understand that everything that I had ever been, whatever I had lived in this life, that all of it had come to an end, just had come to an end. It was fascinating then, and it's still fascinating today when I think back to my old life. What an archetype it was, what a movie it was, and how public it was. An odd thing now in madness, you can tolerate being on display in any sort of way, but nonetheless, I went into isolation. I lived entirely without contact, lived off the land, and waited for the voice. I think the most unusual aspect of it all was in the fact this the stage that the eventual encounter was set upon. I guess it's the stage that in the end was everything. And I was drawn to that stage. I can remember when I first settled on the island, one of the parents of my students, I was a teacher at the country school, knew I was looking for a place to live. They told me about this place in the village of San Juan, a house that was called Cascastu. The house had been built by a violin player and her husband, and they lived in Mallorca. They had done a lot of work in trying to fix it up and gave it some beauty. In fact, the house itself wasn't really the main house. It's why it was called Castu. This is the little house rather than the Khan, which referred to the main house. The main the main house, Kankatsu, was ruina, a ruin. When I first went there, it was very beautiful. They had taken what in fact had been a corral, what had been the place where the sheep had been kept. They had refurbished it and expanded it and created a beautiful little courtyard. It was a lovely little house. I was fascinated by what was beyond the courtyard. I remembered the first time I walked up there, the first time I walked up the hill behind the main, what was then the new house, and walked up behind to look at the old house, this old ruin. As you can see in the image, it was something that was deeply broken down. The house had been built about 300 years ago. And like all early farmhouses, they were deeply dependent on the ability to find water. The water resources dried up, and the house had been a ruin for probably 100 to 150 years. Basically, the entire roofing of the whole original house had disappeared. The people that had bought the property, the husband, had begun a project to try to turn the old ruina into eventually a kind of guest house and studio. He had begun repair on one of the rooms. what was the only bedroom of that house. When you walked up to the ruina, to the main door, the doors were long gone. They had been basically used for something else, looted, burned, whatever. Just before the main door on the left, there was a cistern that led into an empty cavern. And it was in this empty cavern where the design crystal bundle would come. In a sense, I sat over the source of this vast filtration of form principle knowledge. When you walk through that opening doorway, you're actually in a courtyard. It was actually the main room of the house, along with the kitchen that would have been on the right, with an old destroyed fireplace and no roof. And then there was the main door. That is the door to the one room. They had found some very old door to use there with a huge iron key. That iron key struck me in an odd way. Years before I had disappeared from Canada, one of the things that I did in recreation, drawing in pen in ink and pen. I was always placing some kind of objects or symbols in my drawing. Not as much as an intellectual construct, just things that just emerged. One of them was a drawing of this traditional iron key, an iron key that a decade later would be in my hand, and I would open up that ruina room for the first time and step inside. It was Spartan, to say the least. There was a wooden platform with some mats on it that could be used as a place to sleep. There was a wood plank on top of some bricks that acted as a desk, a stool, and there was a stove. And there were the beginnings of rudimentary shelving that had been put in along with the roof that had been restored. And there was a lantern that hung above the platform. There was something about the room that struck me. Anyway, as I began my life in the house below somebody that I met, an Englishman, a very talented being, somebody who was in fact a very fine poet, somebody who had a real taste for seeing the world and experiencing it, was in hard times. As a matter of fact, he was surviving by making what were rather beautiful hanging butterflies. These big sort of butterflies with canvas painted wings that you would hang from your ceiling. They were sold in the hippie markets of that era. He made them. We became friends. I invited him to stay in the ruina, to live in the ruina because he had no place to stay. And that way, that room, for the first time in over 150 years, began to live again. He filled it up with things. He was an amateur herbologist, and he used to wander around the countryside, finding all kinds of extraordinary herbs and wild roots and things that he would catalog and put in jars and stick on the shelves. And of course, his butterfly making equipment and other things, masks that he had collected, and all kinds of things that were part of what was his life. In that era, things moved in different ways, I suppose. There was not a lot of stability. He was in and out of that environment, and the environment basically stayed sort of his. At some point, because of the nature of my own direction, what was happening to me, it was in the fall of 1985 on the winter solstice, December 21st. I went on a long journey that would take me across Europe into the Holy Land. And it would be not until the spring equinox that I returned. We gave up the house, but the poet remained in the ruina. By 1986, I was really homeless and very much isolated when I met him one day. He said to me, I'm going away and I'll be gone for about 6 months. So why don't you stay in the ruina? I thought, wonderful. That's wonderful. That was September. I think it was September 1986 that I actually moved into the ruina with all his things there, the books and the herbs, the masks and all the things that in so many ways will become the components of a mystical event. I still reflect on how interesting it was that the whole environment was prepared in that way. I had nothing. Everything was prepared. Everything that was necessary. It was all waiting. I moved into the ruina. and began to live what was a pure Aryan life. And when I say Aryan, I mean that in the sense that I'm an Aries, an archetypal Aries, sun, moon, and Aries. I had no money. I could not afford kerosene for the lantern. There was no electricity. There was no plumbing. The only way that worked for me was that I lived by the light. I would get up with the light and I would go to a sleep with the light. I lived in isolation and I had no contact with the world around me. My timings didn't really have any interference, any problems of interference with that. It is how I lived until months later I would have my encounter. And the ruina, years after the encounter, years later after human design was known, and I had been working with design professionally for many years. I was in a cafe in the Pueblo of San Juan, near where the ruina was. A man came up to me, somebody I knew casually. He said, I just bought this property where you had your experience. I said, oh, that's interesting. He said, I would really like to build a cabin, a guest house on the side of the ruin. Would you mind? I said, no, I don't mind. You can tear it down. He said, good. Aside from that, I keep on getting people dropping by wanting to stay there overnight, which I thought was very cute. So it was destroyed. It's not there, it's gone. And so it should be. This concludes the reading of The Life and Death of Robin Joseph, excerpts from the prequel to Encounter by Ra Uruhu. The following is a recording of the life and death of Robin Joseph, excerpts from the prequels to his encounter.